Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Prime Live. So for the last few weeks, the newly elected or the returning President Donald Trump has been basking in the praise of forcing a ceasefire in Gaza, but his most recent statements on Palestine have been so alarming. He's proposing that Egypt and Jordan take in refugees from Gaza to allow Israel to ethnically cleanse Palestinians and set up luxury properties on the beaches of Gaza. To help us unpack what this means for the region and world peace, I'm now joined by the founding director at the Center for Africa and Near East Studies, Bilal Bassiouni. Bilal, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Prime Live.
Wa alaikum assalam rahmatullah, Muhammad. It's good to be with you.
Always a pleasure having you. Bilal, a lot of discussions this month have centered around Trump 2.0 and how his new administration will impact global events. In the last 10 days, so much has happened since he's come to office. I mean, some of the things he's said, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, wanting to annex Greenland and Mexico and Canada. Do you think moving on to the Middle East, will we see a more peaceful or a more volatile Middle East under this new Trump and his administration?
Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question here, Mohammed. So if the Trump 2.0 administration follows the trajectory of what we saw in his first stint, I believe that the Middle East is more likely to experience heightened volatility rather than any forms of greater stability. So particularly because his policies are quite transactional and pressure-based foreign policy that rewards allies willing to, align with U.S. interests, but at the same time exerting maximum pressure on adversaries. Now, this is quite a dangerous mixture when it comes to foreign policy, given the shifts again in the regional dynamics since he left office and now what he's coming towards at this stage. This approach can have, I believe, in fact, quite significant destabilizing effects.
We do know the current truce in Gaza is a very fragile truce and things can change on a minute-by-minute basis. Today we'll see the third batch of Israeli hostages will be released in Gaza. Do you think a permanent ceasefire can be achieved? Especially under the Netanyahu, who is such a warmonger. He doesn't come across as somebody who wants that ceasefire to last.
No, exactly that. So the current truce, despite it being successful, in facilitating humanitarian relief and hostage exchange, it's not built on the foundation that really addresses the core issues that drive the hostilities. So instead, it's a temporary, and we need to view it as a temporary arrangement. And depends on immediate interests particularly of Israelis involved, rather than any long-term strategic resolution. So the issue of Palestinian statehood, and on the Israeli side, the governance issue in Gaza in the future remain unresolved. So as long as the asymmetrical relationship in the objectives between Israel and the Palestinian side, this is also going to remain the case. Adding another layer to that is the internal dynamics within Israel, Mohammed. So particularly under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who views Hamas as an existential threat, and framed the war as a campaign to dismantle the group's military capabilities permanently. Of course, this wasn't achieved. But for him, any ceasefire that leaves Hamas intact is, from Israel's perspective, a temporary pause than any step towards sustainable peace. On the other hand, Hamas, despite some military losses that we've seen, remains quite politically entrenched in Gaza and still can strengthen its long-term position. So meaning that a complete succession or a stop in the hostilities will only be limited in time, which guarantees immediate and short-term goals for both parties. Adding to this mix now, regional developments such as the bringing in of quite a transactional leader, as we discussed, like U.S. President Donald Trump. This adds to the volatility around the ceasefire. Now, I believe it will hold in the short term until at least the hostages, or what Israeli deems as hostages, are returned. They are unlikely. There's a lot of variables in this mixture that can bring back fighting in a very quick step.
Looking at the Middle East, we knew during the first term of Donald Trump, he had the Abrahamic Accords signed. We saw Sudan, Morocco, the UAE all signing up to these accords, and also normalization of ties with Israel. Following the genocide in Gaza over the last almost 2 years, do you think these countries are going to be willing to go ahead with this normalization, especially knowing what the Israelis have done in Gaza with over 50,000 people killed, millions displaced, children, women? Do you think countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Sudan, do you think they'll all be interested?
Yeah, again, so this was a massive policy push from the first administration of President Donald Trump, but it will be much more difficult precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, Mohammed. So the initial agreement did succeed in somewhat because of the relative stable geopolitical environment that agreement existed in initially. But now, as you said, the landscape is entirely different. So the Gaza war and the mass casualties specifically that followed has hardened international public positions, including in many of these countries that were, floating this idea of normalizing with Israel. So making it politically dangerous for any leader to sign a new deal, particularly without a complete resolution of the Palestinian statehood issue, which again, Saudi Arabia was a candidate under the first administration of Donald Trump, and now Donald Trump will likely focus on Saudi Arabia specifically to bring it back to negotiations around normalization. It has hinged this whole process around the resolution of the Palestinian state and move towards the Palestinian state. And as we know that this hardline governments around Palestinian sovereignty, or even the reduction of expansion within the West Bank settlement, etc. So the leadership within Saudi Arabia and other countries that were thinking around normalizing will face enormous pressure from their populations and from the broader international public, including the Muslim and Arab world, and they will try to distance themselves from Israel rather than actually move closer at this stage. So even if it was in the pipeline historically, I think this has shifted into a more long-term position. I don't think any countries at this stage are willing to put themselves in the line of fire, particularly from the domestic populations, given how the atrocities and the number of casualties, including also Israel being facing charges at the ICC and ICJ. So it's not a good PR exercise by any country to undertake at this stage.
Bilal Bassiouni, Jazakallah so much for your time. I think really important points made across about the current issues in the Middle East. And at the end of the day, we just need to turn to prayer, make dua to the Almighty for the safety of our brethren in Gaza. Bilal Bassiouni, Jazakallah, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
That was Bilal Bassiouni speaking to us about what's going to happen in Palestine, considering we have a new American president, Donald Trump 2.0. Let's see how it's all going to pan out in the next few weeks. We're going to take a short break now. Stay tuned.